Every night at 11:30, America tuned in expecting laughter. What they got instead was one of the most dangerous performances in television history. Behind the bright lights of The Tonight Show, some of Hollywood's biggest legends were fighting battles no one could see. Trembling hands. Racing hearts. Bodies running on pills, powder, and pure willpower. Johnny Carson smiled through it all, never letting the cameras catch what he already knew. Tonight, we're pulling back the curtain on the guests who almost didn't make it through their own interview, and the secrets they carried straight into the spotlight.
We had 5 kinds of potatoes. I don't know if this happens in your home, but...
He built an entire career on falling down, but by the mid-'80s, Chevy Chase couldn't stand up without help. The man who made America laugh with pratfalls was now hiding a secret that would have ended most careers overnight. Backstage at NBC Studios in Burbank, the room was quiet except for the sound of a pill bottle rattling. Chevy adjusted his collar in the mirror, running through the motions one more time. Years earlier, a stunt gone wrong on Saturday Night Live had left him with permanent damage to his spine. The pain never left. It just sat there, buried under a mountain of painkillers, waiting for the moment the medication wore off. To get through the night, he needed 2 things working against each other. A strong opioid to numb the agony in his back, and a line of cocaine to fight off the drowsiness the painkillers caused. Together they created something strange, a man who felt untouchable on the outside while his body quietly betrayed him underneath. When he walked onto the stage, the swagger was unmistakable. Hands in his pockets, chin up, that same effortless charm the audience adored. But Johnny Carson noticed something the crowd missed. The walk was too stiff. The shoulders too rigid. This wasn't relaxed confidence. This was a man carefully controlling every movement so his spine wouldn't give out in front of millions of viewers. Sitting down took effort. He lowered himself slowly, back straight as a board, masking the pain with a practiced ease that had become second nature. The interview moved fast, sharp jokes, clipped answers, a coolness that bordered on arrogance. The chemicals in his system had convinced him he was untouchable, and it showed in every word. Johnny kept pace, tapping his pencil against the desk, a small tell that he was reading between the lines. He'd interviewed enough guests to recognize when someone's edge wasn't talent, it was pharmaceuticals. Chevy's eyes stayed locked, unblinking, distant in a way that didn't match the jokes coming out of his mouth. Underneath the confidence was something far more fragile. Chevy knew exactly what he depended on to get through each day. He remembered being bedridden, unable to do the simplest tasks because the pain was too severe. Now here he was, performing for an audience that had no idea the man making them laugh was barely holding himself together. Every laugh from the crowd gave him a moment of relief, a distraction stronger than any medication. It was the only thing that worked better than the pills in his pocket. When the show ended, the transformation was instant. The moment he stepped out of camera view, his hand shot to his lower back. The pain had been waiting the entire time, and now it came back with full force. He walked with a limp, no trace of the confident star left. The man who made falling down look effortless on screen was now struggling just to stay upright in the hallway. That night, millions watched Chevy Chase at his sharpest and funniest. None of them knew the truth. Behind the jokes was a man trapped in his own body, running on borrowed time and empty bottles, just trying to make it to the next appearance.
The man who threw up.
He had some strange...
June 1968. When Johnny Carson announced her name, the entire studio erupted before she even stepped through the curtain. But backstage, in a room the spotlights hadn't reached yet, a woman was fighting a battle that had already lasted 3 decades. Judy Garland wasn't just the girl who once sang her way to Oz. She was someone who had been shaped since childhood by a system that handed her pills before it ever asked how she felt. The studio gave her stimulants to keep working through 18-hour days, and sedatives to knock her out when the day finally ended. By the time she reached this chair, at 46 years old, that chemical cycle was the only way she knew how to function. In the small waiting room, her hands trembled as she gripped the edge of the vanity. 2 bottles sat beside her makeup, one to wake her up, one to quiet the fear in her head. She swallowed a handful of both, hoping they would balance out just long enough to get her through the interview the world expected. When she walked onto the stage, she looked impossibly fragile, as if she might be carried away by nothing more than a breeze. Instead of a simple handshake, she grabbed Johnny's hand and held on tight, like someone afraid of losing their footing in front of millions of people. Her palm was cold and damp, her grip almost desperate. Once she sat down, the effects of the stimulants surfaced immediately. She spoke fast, words tumbling over each other, her energy loud and constant. But every so often, mid-sentence, her eyes would go blank for a second. She'd forget what she was saying entirely, staring at Johnny with the confused look of someone who had lost their place completely. Johnny never pushed. He guided her gently back into the conversation, letting silences pass without drawing attention to them. He knew she wasn't just under the influence. She was in real pain, and this interview was one of the only places left where she felt seen. At one point, she looked at him and asked quietly if people still loved her. It wasn't part of any script. It was the honest question of someone who had spent her whole life performing for others while feeling utterly alone. When it came time to sing, she couldn't stand. She sang from the chair instead. Her voice, once flawless, now cracked and struggled for breath. But somehow, within that imperfection, the emotion came through stronger than ever. She closed her eyes and gave everything she had left. The moment the song ended, she collapsed inward, drained completely. The stimulants had worn off, leaving nothing but exhaustion behind. The audience gave a standing ovation, moved to tears, unaware they were watching something closer to a farewell than a performance. Backstage, she couldn't walk without help. 2 assistants supported her as she left, mumbling softly, barely conscious of her surroundings. Less than a year later, news broke from London. Judy Garland had died from an accidental overdose. Anyone who had truly watched her that night already knew the ending long before it arrived.
Here's Carrie Fisher.
By the late 70s, Star Wars had turned an unknown actress into one of the most recognized faces on the planet. Princess Leia, with her calm poise and quiet strength, had become a symbol millions looked up to. But the moment Carrie Fisher walked into the NBC studio to sit across from Johnny Carson, that symbol disappeared completely. In her place was a sharp, restless young woman carrying a secret far more chaotic than anything on screen. She couldn't sit still backstage. She paced the small dressing room, heels clicking against the floor in a fast, uneven rhythm that matched the racing of her own heart. Hours earlier, she had come straight from a party that ran through the entire night, one where cocaine had been passed around as casually as any other drink. Carrie had grown up under enormous pressure, the daughter of a major Hollywood star, and somewhere along the way she had thrown herself fully into that world of excess. Before stepping in front of the cameras, she gave herself one more boost, enough to guarantee she'd be the sharpest, most entertaining guest of the night. She felt unstoppable, like her mind was running faster than everyone else in the room combined. When Johnny called her name, she walked out with an energy that was almost aggressive, nothing like the shy, composed persona people expected. She sat down, but her body stayed tense the entire time. Her hands moved constantly, clasping together, releasing, smoothing her hair, never settling. Her eyes darted around the studio, taking in every detail with an intensity that wasn't natural. The interview moved quickly, and the audience laughed at nearly everything she said, convinced they were witnessing pure, effortless wit. But Johnny, a man who had sat across from thousands of guests, picked up on something small. Every few minutes, her finger would rise briefly to her nose, or she'd sniff quietly, almost automatically. It wasn't allergies. It was habit, one she had folded so seamlessly into her mannerisms that most people would never notice. She was performing 2 roles at once, the clever guest the audience adored, and someone quietly working to appear steady while everything underneath was running at full speed. When the segment ended, she stood to shake Johnny's hand, her palm ice cold despite the sweat. She walked backstage with the same sharp click of her heels, but the moment she was out of view, her shoulders dropped. The performance was over, and what remained was pure exhaustion. She leaned against the wall, rubbing her temple as a headache began to build behind her eyes. Had she convinced everyone? Probably. All they saw was a witty, confident star fully in control. But she knew that once the lights went out and the studio emptied, the silence waiting for her at home would be unbearable, and she would once again reach for the only thing that seemed to make it disappear.
Miss Elizabeth Taylor.
Under the blinding lights of NBC Studio One, Elizabeth Taylor sat alone in her dressing room, feeling something the powerful spotlights couldn't fix. A deep, bone-level cold, the kind that comes from a body demanding to be refueled rather than from any draft in the room. On the cluttered vanity, next to expensive perfume and her script for the night, sat the only thing that truly mattered to her right now. A glass of watered-down liquor and a half-empty pack of pills. She skipped the water entirely, dry swallowing a strong opioid painkiller before chasing it down with a sip of alcohol. It was a routine she knew well, one she quietly called her breakfast of champions, the only thing keeping her upright against a pain that never seemed to stop. Within minutes, the chemicals took hold. The sharp, stabbing pain across her back faded into a soft, spreading numbness. Her pupils narrowed to pinpoints under the studio lights, though no one else in the room seemed to notice. The edges of her vision blurred, the world suddenly distant, as if she were viewing everything through water. When the assistant knocked to warn her the show was starting soon, it took her a moment to even process the words. She wasn't standing on strength anymore. She was standing because the drugs were holding her up. And when Johnny Carson called her name, the applause was thunderous, but underneath her graceful, practiced walk was a woman who couldn't actually feel her own feet touching the ground. Johnny caught it instantly. The faint smell of alcohol beneath her perfume, the extra weight she leaned into his hand as he guided her to her seat. Her palm was ice cold, yet damp with sweat, the kind of reaction only the body produces when it's fighting something internally. The conversation began, and inside her head, the real struggle started. Her mouth had gone completely dry, a common effect of the medication in her system. When Johnny asked a simple question about her latest film, she had to stall, reaching for the water glass just to buy herself a few extra seconds. To the audience, it looked elegant. To Johnny, it looked like someone desperately trying to get words moving again. Her responses came slower than usual, her thoughts scattered and difficult to piece together. She had to bite down gently just to snap herself back into focus. Her voice, when it finally came, sounded normal to everyone watching, but to her, it echoed strangely, as if someone else entirely was speaking through her. At certain moments, her gaze drifted somewhere past Johnny's shoulder, unfocused, lost in a space only she could see. Her hand kept twisting the ring on her finger, an unconscious, repetitive motion that never seemed to stop. Johnny carried the conversation expertly, filling in gaps whenever she lost her train of thought completely. When the audience laughed loudly at one point, she flinched, her eyes flashing with a brief, unmistakable look of panic before she smoothed it over again. The moment the segment ended, she sank fully into her chair, all remaining energy gone. She whispered that she needed to go backstage, her voice hoarse and stripped of any glamour. As she stood, she reached instinctively for her purse, not for anything practical, but because she knew there was one more dose waiting inside. The show had ended, but for her, the need never really stopped. The moment the band struck up a swinging tune and the stage doors opened, a burst of unstoppable energy would sweep through the studio. That was Sammy Davis Jr., a man everyone called Mr. Show Business. Small in height but massive in presence, he moved across the stage with tap steps and quick slides, wrapping Johnny Carson in a tight, enthusiastic hug before the audience had even finished cheering. But underneath that dazzling smile, few realized Sammy wasn't performing out of pure joy. He was running, from a painful divorce that had left him isolated, from a body wearing down under years of heavy drinking, and from a night that had already started with a dangerous combination of cocaine and inhalants. Backstage, in a room thick with cigarette smoke and cologne, a very different Sammy sat slouched in his chair, eyes tired, staring blankly ahead. His marriage had ended years earlier, and that wound had never fully closed, pushing him deeper into a lifestyle of non-stop parties and late nights. Beside a glass of brandy that never seemed to empty sat the substances that had become his way of steadying trembling hands. He took a long snort of white powder, feeling it hit his system instantly, jolting his exhausted nerves back to life. But that wasn't enough on its own. He reached for a small vial of inhalant as well, something used to create a quick, intense rush. His heartbeat picked up rapidly, sweat beginning to form, and slowly the version of Sammy the world adored started to reappear, ready to put the mask back on. Once he sat across from Johnny, the difference between the two men was obvious. Johnny remained calm, settled comfortably into his seat, while Sammy looked like he could barely stay still. He crossed and uncrossed his legs constantly, his arms moving with restless energy, gold chains clinking with every gesture, a clear sign of the stimulants racing through his system. He lit a cigarette with a gold lighter, and if you looked closely, one detail stood out. His pinky nail was noticeably longer than the rest. To most viewers, it looked like nothing more than a stylish choice. But to those familiar with certain circles, it served a very different purpose entirely. Johnny noticed it. He noticed the sweat forming despite the cold studio air, and he understood exactly what state his old friend was in. That night, America saw the liveliest, most charming version of Sammy Davis Jr. What they didn't see was what happened the second the cameras cut to commercial. The energy would drain instantly. He'd bury his face in his hands, his small frame shaking from exhaustion and cold all at once. He was Mr. Show Business, yes, but he was also trapped by the very spotlight that made him famous, forced to drink, forced to use, just to keep being the man everyone expected to see, even as it quietly wore him down piece by piece.
Burt Reynolds.
By the mid-'80s, NBC studios still looked as glamorous as ever, but the mood inside one particular dressing room felt nothing like the rest of the building. A man sat in front of the mirror, struggling to button his own shirt, a task that should have taken seconds but instead took 3 failed attempts. This was Burt Reynolds, once the biggest symbol of effortless charm in Hollywood. But the reflection staring back at him now barely resembled that image. His cheeks had hollowed out, his eyes looked distant and drained, and his expensive suit hung off a frame that had lost far too much weight far too quickly. Outside, rumors were spreading fast about his health, dramatic headlines guessing at the worst. The real explanation sat quietly on his vanity table, an orange prescription bottle holding a powerful sleep medication. It had started after an accident on a film set years earlier, when a heavy prop had struck his jaw during a stunt gone wrong. The pain that followed never faded. It became a constant, grinding presence that made eating, sleeping, and simply existing feel unbearable. To cope, he turned to a strong sedative meant only for short-term use. What began as a single dose to catch a few hours of sleep had grown into dozens of pills a day, an amount that would be dangerous for almost anyone, yet for him it had become the only way to function at all. When the show's theme music started, he stood up, but it barely felt like walking. The heavy sedation caused him to drift through the motions, disconnected from everything around him. Applause greeted him as he stepped onto the stage, though it sounded distant, muffled, like it was reaching him through water. Johnny Carson's smile faltered for just a moment when he saw how much weight his old friend had lost. As they shook hands, he could feel the uncontrollable trembling running through Burt's fingers, the unmistakable sign of a nervous system overwhelmed by medication. Settling into the chair took visible effort, his joints stiff and resistant. The sedative hit harder than usual that night, pulling at his focus, blurring his vision, making Johnny's voice feel like it was arriving in slow motion. When asked a light-hearted question about staying fit, panic flickered behind his eyes for a split second, his mind struggling to catch up. Somehow, instinct took over. He forced a grin, despite the ongoing pain in his jaw, and offered a joking response about being on a strange diet. It wasn't a joke at all. Chewing had become nearly impossible because of his injury, and the medication had wiped out any appetite he had left. He was quietly starving in front of millions of viewers, hiding it behind humor. Johnny laughed along with the audience, but his eyes stayed concerned. He recognized that distant, glassy stare, a look he'd seen before in guests dealing with heavy sedation. When the cameras finally cut and the lights dimmed, Burt could no longer hold himself up. An assistant rushed to support him as a quiet groan escaped through clenched teeth. The pain was returning now that the medication was wearing thin, demanding another dose just to get through the rest of the night. On screen, he remained a beloved, funny legend. But backstage, in the quiet of the hallway, he was simply a man exhausted from fighting a battle that had started with one accident and grown into something he could no longer control alone.
It's 9 o'clock, and here on NBC, would you welcome Miss Liza Minnelli?
Whenever Johnny Carson announced her name, the orchestra always played something louder, brighter, more theatrical than they did for any other guest. Liza Minnelli didn't simply walk onto the stage, she arrived like a burst of fireworks. Cropped hair, striking eyes, a sequin dress that caught every bit of the studio lights, she looked like someone built entirely for the spotlight. The audience cheered instantly, clapping along with her energy, completely unaware that behind the wide smile, a much quieter struggle was taking place. Johnny, a longtime friend of her family, could sense it immediately, even if the crowd couldn't. That night, Liza was balancing on a thin edge, one steadied by a sedative and a glass of wine. In her dressing room before the show, the atmosphere wasn't relaxed at all. It felt anxious, tight, restless. Being born into Hollywood royalty meant she'd inherited not just talent, but also a fragile emotional world and a habit of leaning on substances to quiet it. On her vanity sat a small yellow pill, the kind doctors handed out freely at the time for anxiety, next to a glass of wine she casually referred to as her way of unwinding. She needed the pill to silence the constant nervous chatter in her mind, but that same medication also slowed her down physically. To fight through the drowsiness and keep up the lively image everyone expected from her, she turned to alcohol as a counterbalance, forcing her body into an artificial kind of energy. Once she sat beside Johnny, the audience saw exactly what they came for, a warm, animated, larger-than-life woman filled with laughter. But look closely, and her movements were slightly too big, her gestures a touch too loose. This wasn't just her natural performance style. It was her body trying to release the tension building from two substances working against each other inside her. She couldn't stay still for more than a few seconds at a time, constantly shifting position, leaning toward Johnny, then pulling back, laughing loudly to fill any pause that lasted too long. Johnny watched her carefully, the way someone watches a person they've known since childhood. He could see traces of her mother in her, not in appearance, but in that same fragile energy hidden beneath a loud, cheerful exterior. When he gently asked about her demanding schedule, her smile froze for a brief second before she recovered, taking a quick sip of water to steady herself. Her answers came fast, almost rushed, as if silence itself might expose something she wasn't ready to show. She insisted everything in her life was wonderful, her voice rising with forced enthusiasm, though a slight tremble slipped through near the end of the sentence. She wasn't just telling the audience that. She was trying to convince herself. When the segment ended and the cameras cut away, all that forced brightness disappeared instantly. She sank back into her chair, her hand trembling as she wiped away sweat. The artificial high from the alcohol had faded, leaving only heaviness behind. Watching her own reflection on the monitor nearby, she saw something that unsettled her, an unmistakable resemblance to her mother, and the quiet fear that she might be walking the exact same path.
Superman. Richard Pryor.
Whenever Johnny Carson announced that the next guest was Richard Pryor, something in the room changed instantly. The relaxed, easygoing mood of a typical late-night taping disappeared, replaced by a tension mixed with excitement. The audience knew they were about to laugh harder than they had all week. But behind the scenes, the crew knew something else entirely, that the man walking out wasn't just a comedic genius. He was operating on the edge of something dangerous. Richard stepped onto the stage with the energy of a storm barely contained, moving fast, eyes scanning the room non-stop. The applause hit him like a wave, but to him, the sound felt distorted, filtered through a heartbeat racing far beyond normal. Minutes earlier in his dressing room, he hadn't just used a small amount of a stimulant for confidence. He had gone through a far more intense process, one that turned a common substance into its purest, most potent form, meant to be smoked rather than snorted. The effect wasn't ordinary euphoria. It hit like an explosion through his entire nervous system, making him feel unstoppable one moment and deeply paranoid the next. Johnny, a man skilled at handling unpredictable guests, studied him carefully, catching the wildness behind his eyes. It was the look of someone whose mind was somewhere else entirely, seeing things the audience couldn't. The drug gave him an overwhelming sense of confidence, almost godlike, but it also whispered doubt into his mind at the same time. As the crowd laughed at his jokes, a different thought crept in quietly. Were they laughing with him, or were they secretly against him? That paranoia pushed him to lean even harder into the comedy, turning his own addiction into material, mimicking the shakes, the wide eyes, the twitching limbs, all while the audience assumed it was simply brilliant physical acting. In private, he often spoke about fire, though no one around him understood just how literal that would eventually become. Only a short time later, an accident during one of these same sessions would leave him with severe burns covering much of his body, a moment he would later speak about with brutal honesty in one of his most iconic performances. But that night, sitting across from Johnny, the fire hadn't reached the surface yet. It was still building quietly inside his mind. When the closing music played, Richard stood and waved to the crowd, his energy still buzzing, unfinished. But the second he stepped away from the lights and into the shadows backstage, the smile vanished completely. He gasped for air, pressing his back against the wall, one hand clutching his chest as his heart pounded violently. An assistant handed him a towel without a word. Richard said nothing either, his eyes distant and unfocused once more. He had done his job, making an entire nation laugh. Now all that waited for him was an empty house, and the quiet return to the very habit the world had no idea he was fighting.